A suspicious millionaire decides to install hidden cameras to watch the new nanny caring for his wheelchair-bound son. He believes he is protecting the boy, but each recording reveals something that challenges his certainties and touches his hardened heart. Until a phrase whispered by the woman changes everything and exposes a secret about the child's past. What he discovers in the footage is so shocking that it completely transforms his views on love, guilt, and family. The Montgomery mansion was a monument to solitude, located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City. Its marble walls and mirrored windows reflected the coldness of its owner, the entrepreneur Richard Montgomery. At 42, he commanded a tech empire that had revolutionized the American market, but he couldn't manage what was left of his own family. The office was his refuge. Seated before monitors displaying graphs and spreadsheets, Richard spent hours analyzing the performance of his companies. On that October afternoon, as the New York spring colored the mansion's garden, he kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, ignoring the landscape that unfolded beyond the panoramic windows. 3 soft knocks on the door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he ordered, without looking away from the numbers. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, who had worked for the family for over 20 years, entered with hesitant steps. "Mr. Montgomery, the candidates for Leo's caregiver position have started to arrive." Richard finally looked up. A crease of concern formed between his thick eyebrows. "How many have come?" "5, sir. All with references as you requested." He took a deep breath, adjusting the navy blue tie that matched his impeccable suit. He stood up with a sharp movement, as if wanting to shake off the insecurity that overcame him whenever he had to make decisions related to his son. "I will interview them now. Prepare the sitting room." As he walked down the hallway, Richard paused before a framed photograph on the wall. In it, a woman with brown hair and a luminous smile held a baby in her arms. Eleanor, his wife, who had died 2 years ago in an accident that seemed to have frozen time in that house. Since then, Leo, now 5 years old, had been confined to a custom wheelchair, a consequence of a condition that, according to the doctors, would be with him forever. Upon entering the sitting room, Richard observed the 5 women waiting, seated in various postures that revealed their different degrees of anxiety. 4 of them seemed to have come from the same mold: impeccable uniforms, hair tied back, professional expressions. The 5th, however, stood out by contrast. Amelia Hayes wore a simple red dress with a small white apron folded in her lap. Her curly hair was pulled back into an unpretentious bun, with a few rebellious strands framing her delicately featured face. When Richard entered, she was the only one who did not stand up immediately, seemingly lost in distant thoughts. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, with the firm voice he used in corporate meetings. "I appreciate your interest in the position. As you may know, I am looking for someone who can care for my son with dedication and competence." The interviews proceeded in sequence. Richard asked the same questions to all of them: professional experience, references, salary expectations. The answers sounded mechanical, rehearsed, as if those women were auditioning for a role they didn't really want to play. When it was Amelia's turn, the dynamic changed. She smiled with a disarming spontaneity. "Mr. Montgomery, before I answer your questions, I would like to ask one myself. If you'll allow me." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised by her audacity. "And what would that be? Your son, does he like stories, music? What are the things that make his eyes light up?" The question caught Richard off guard. Eleanor would have known the answer immediately, but him, what did he really know about his own son's tastes? "Leo is reserved," he replied, feeling the discomfort of his own ignorance. "Since he lost his mother, he speaks very little. In fact, he hardly speaks at all." Amelia's smile softened, taking on a tone of understanding that irritated Richard. He didn't need this stranger's pity. "I understand. Losing someone we love is like losing a part of ourselves," she said, a shadow passing over her brown eyes. "My brother passed away 6 months ago. An accident. We were very close." Something in the way she spoke, without drama or self-pity, touched Richard in an unexpected way. There was authenticity in those words, a genuine feeling that contrasted with the calculated professionalism of the other candidates. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his words. "What is your experience with children?" "I worked as a pediatric nursing assistant for 5 years at St. Jude's Hospital. But honestly, I believe my greatest qualification is understanding what it's like to feel an emptiness and still find reasons to smile every day." Richard studied Amelia's resume. Her references were good, though not as impressive as those of the other candidates. There was something about her, however, a combination of strength and tenderness that seemed exactly what Leo needed. "Would you like to meet my son?" he asked on an impulse that contradicted his calculating nature. Amelia's eyes lit up. It would be an honor. While the other candidates were dismissed with vague promises of a callback, Richard led Amelia to Leo's room. During the walk through the mansion's corridors, he noticed how she attentively observed every detail, not with the invasive curiosity of someone assessing possessions, but with the keen eye of someone trying to understand the story told by that environment. "Leo spends most of his time in his room," Richard explained, stopping before a blue door decorated with silver stars, Eleanor's idea, who believed their son was born to shine. "He has physical therapy 3 times a week, but he rarely goes out for other activities." When they opened the door, they found the boy sitting in his custom wheelchair, in front of a window that offered a view of the garden. Small for his age, Leo had his mother's brown hair and his father's piercing green eyes. However, his gaze lacked Richard's typical intensity, replaced by a premature melancholy that seemed out of place in such a young child. "Leo, this is Amelia," Richard introduced with the formality that characterized his relationship with his son. "She came to talk with you." The boy looked at the visitor without any reaction, then returned to contemplating the garden. That indifference cut Richard as it always did, reminding him of his inability to cross the barrier that had been erected between them after Eleanor's passing. Amelia, however, did not seem discouraged. She approached the wheelchair and knelt, bringing herself to Leo's eye level without invading his space. "Hello, Leo," she said with a soft voice. "What a beautiful view you have here. Do you know the name of that flowering tree out there?" The boy didn't answer, but his eyes flickered in the direction she pointed. "It's a flowering dogwood," Amelia continued. "They say it blooms to remind us that even after the grey days, colour always returns." For an instant, so brief that Richard almost doubted what he'd seen, Leo's lips curved slightly. It wasn't exactly a smile, but it was closer to one than any expression his father had observed in months. "I brought something with me," Amelia said, pulling a small kaleidoscope from her bag. "It's magical. When you look through it, the world becomes full of different shapes and colors." Carefully, she offered the object to Leo. The boy hesitated, but eventually accepted it. When he placed the kaleidoscope to his right eye and turned it, something extraordinary happened. A small sound escaped his lips, something between a gasp of surprise and a stifled laugh. Richard felt his heart clench. How long had it been since he had heard any sound of joy from his son? He watched, fascinated, as Amelia talked to Leo about the shapes and colors appearing in the kaleidoscope, without forcing answers, respecting his silences, but maintaining a warm presence that seemed to wrap the boy in a bubble of safety. After 15 minutes that seemed to transform the heavy atmosphere of the room, Amelia stood up and returned the kaleidoscope to her bag. "It was a pleasure to meet you. Leo, I hope we can see each other again." To Richard's astonishment, the boy extended his small hand towards her, a clear gesture that he didn't want her to leave. Amelia held Leo's hand gently. "I promise I'll come back to show you more magical things," she said, with a smile that lit up her face. When they left the room, Richard felt torn between the relief of seeing his son respond positively to someone and a pang of jealousy at the ease with which Amelia had achieved what he had been trying for months. "When can you start?" he asked as soon as they reached the hallway. "Tomorrow, if you prefer." "Excellent. Mrs. Gable will show you your accommodations. We provide a room and meals in addition to the salary. Leo needs constant supervision. I understand. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Montgomery." As he watched Amelia follow Mrs. Gable to see the rest of the house, Richard felt a growing unease. There was something about her he couldn't quite decipher. A disconcerting familiarity, as if they had met before. Even more disturbing was the way Leo had reacted to her, breaking the pattern of isolation he had maintained for so long. That night, after everyone had retired, Richard entered his office and opened his laptop. With a few clicks, he accessed the interface of the mansion's security system. After a few minutes of consideration, he made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of their lives. He authorized the installation of additional cameras in every room of the house, including Leo's bedroom and the common areas. If Amelia Hayes was hiding something, he would find out. If her intentions were not genuine, he would expose her. After all, he was protecting his most precious asset, the only link that still connected him to Eleanor, and the life he had once dreamed of having. Amelia's arrival transformed the atmosphere of the Montgomery mansion with the subtlety of a spring breeze. On the first day, she appeared with a small suitcase and a wide smile, dressed in the same red uniform and white apron she had worn for the interview. Mrs. Gable, initially suspicious of the new employee, watched with curiosity as Amelia seemed to bring light into the rooms she passed through. "Leo's room needs more color," Amelia commented, as she arranged her few belongings in the small suite designated for staff. "Children need visual stimulation, especially when they spend so much time in one environment." Mrs. Gable nodded, impressed by the insightful observation. "Mr. Montgomery doesn't like changes to the decor since Mrs. Eleanor—" "I understand," Amelia interrupted gently. "But perhaps we can start with small things that don't alter the structure of the room. Drawings, mobiles, objects that bring movement and color without changing what his mother planned." That same afternoon, while Richard was in a meeting in downtown Manhattan, Amelia began her mission with Leo. Sitting beside the boy's wheelchair, she opened a folder full of colorful images, magazine cutouts showing landscapes, animals, and people from different parts of the world. "Let's take a trip without leaving this room," she proposed, spreading the images on the small table Leo used for his activities. "Where would you like to go first?" The boy did not respond verbally, but his small fingers touched a photograph of dolphins leaping over crystal-clear waters. "Excellent choice," Amelia exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "Did you know that dolphins are considered the most intelligent animals after humans? They have very close-knit families called pods, and they take care of each other just like we take care of those we love." As she spoke, Amelia observed Leo's subtle reactions, the sparkle in his green eyes, the way he leaned slightly forward in his chair showing interest. They weren't conventional responses, but for someone as attentive as she was, they represented a universe of communication. Across the city, on the 30th floor of the building that housed his company headquarters, Richard was physically present at a board meeting, but his mind was wandering back to the mansion on the Upper East Side. He had personally installed the app that allowed him to access the security cameras from his phone. Every few minutes he would cast furtive glances at the screen, watching the interaction between Amelia and his son. "Which means a projected 15% increase in profits for the next quarter," explained Mark Evans, his CFO, pointing to elaborate graphs in the slide presentation. Richard nodded automatically, while watching Amelia show something to Leo that made him lean in to get a better look. He zoomed in on the image with his fingers, trying to identify the object. "A book, a photo album? Richard? Any objections to the expansion plan for the Midwest?" Mark's voice brought him back to the meeting room. Richard put his phone away, trying to reorganize his thoughts. "No objections. Proceed with the preparations, but I want to review the contracts before they're signed." As the afternoon progressed, Amelia continued her imaginary journey with Leo. After the dolphins, they visited African savannas, snow-capped mountains, and colorful markets in Morocco. For each place she had a story or a fun fact, always relating it to some aspect that might resonate with the boy. "This is the Statue of Liberty in New York City," she explained, showing the famous statue. "They say her arms are open to embrace everyone, no matter where they come from, as if she's saying everyone deserves to be welcomed." Leo touched the image with his small fingers, tracing the outline of the statue's extended arms. Amelia watched the gesture attentively. "Do you like the idea of hugs?" she asked softly. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't pull his hand away when she covered his little fingers with her own. A moment of silent connection that said more than words. When Richard returned to the mansion, it was already evening. He found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Good evening, Mrs. Gable. Where are Leo and the new employee?" "In his room, sir." Amelia is giving the boy his bath before dinner. Richard nodded and walked down the hall, stopping at his son's bedroom door. He hesitated for a moment. Then, instead of entering, he pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. The image showed Amelia helping Leo into blue pajamas printed with stars while humming a soft tune. "And now, how about we choose a book to read before bed?" she asked after she finished buttoning the pajamas. To Richard's surprise, Leo pointed to the bookshelf, indicating a specific book. Amelia reached for the volume and smiled as she read the title. "The Little Prince. Excellent choice. It's one of my favorites too." As he watched the scene on his phone, Richard felt a contradictory emotion. On one hand, there was relief in seeing his son interacting, showing preferences, actively participating in an activity. On the other, he felt excluded from that connection, a stranger spying on moments of intimacy he had never been able to establish with his own son. He put his phone away and opened the door. The room smelled of soap and children's shampoo. Leo settled in bed with pillows that kept him sitting comfortably, looked towards his father with an expression that was hard to decipher. "Good evening," Richard greeted, with the formality that characterized their interactions. "How was your day?" "We took a trip around the world with photographs," Amelia answered, when it became clear that Leo would not respond. "Your son has excellent taste in places. He chose some of the most beautiful on our planet." Richard approached the bed, feeling out of place in his own home. He noticed a small improvised mural on the wall next to the headboard, some of the photographs he had seen earlier, arranged to create a colorful collage. "I hope you don't mind," Amelia said quickly, noticing his gaze fixed on the new decoration. "I only used small thumbtacks that won't damage the wall. We can easily remove it if you prefer." He thought about objecting, about setting clear boundaries regarding modifications to the house. But the expression on Leo's face, a mixture of expectation and apprehension, made him reconsider. "It's interesting," he conceded. "Did Leo help choose them?" "Every single one," Amelia confirmed with a smile. "We were just about to start reading before bed. Would you like to join us?" The invitation caught Richard off guard. His eyes met his son's, searching for some sign that he would be welcome. Leo's expression remained unchanged, but he shifted slightly to the side, creating space on the bed, a silent invitation that Richard didn't have the heart to refuse. "Just the beginning," he said, sitting cautiously on the edge of the mattress. "I have work to finish in the office." Amelia nodded and opened the book, beginning to read in a melodious voice that seemed to transform the words into something alive, pulsating. The story of the lonely little prince on his tiny planet took on new layers of meaning in that room, where three people were navigating their own solitudes. Richard watched his son from the corner of his eye, noticing how his eyes followed every word attentively, as if he understood not only the surface narrative, but also the deeper truths hidden within the fable. At one point, without realizing it, he relaxed against the pillows, allowing himself to be transported by the story. Just like Leo. When Amelia reached the part where the little prince meets the fox, Richard felt something touch his hand. He looked down and saw Leo's small fingers brushing against his, a contact as light as the flutter of a butterfly's wing, but enough to send a wave of emotion through his entire body. He didn't move, fearing that any reaction might startle away this rare moment of connection. With his heart racing, he allowed his son's fingers to remain there, building a fragile bridge between their separate worlds. "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed," Amelia read, and the words seemed to echo in the room with a special resonance, as if directed specifically at Richard. When the reading was over, Leo had fallen asleep, his small hand still close to his father's. Carefully, Richard stood up, adjusting the blanket around his son. "He seems to like you very much," he commented, as he followed Amelia out of the room. "Children respond to sincerity," she replied simply. "Leo can feel when someone genuinely cares." The implication in her words did not go unnoticed by Richard. He felt his face flush, torn between irritation at the presumed criticism and the painful acknowledgement of his own failure. "I appreciate your efforts on the first day," he said formally. "But I would like to establish some rules. Any changes to Leo's routine or environment must be discussed with me beforehand." Amelia nodded, showing no offense. "I understand, Mr. Montgomery. I just believe that children need stimulation to develop fully, especially children in Leo's situation. And what exactly do you believe his situation to be? Richard asked, narrowing his eyes. A child who lost his mother and feels the absence of his father even when he is physically present, she answered, with a disarming frankness. An intelligent, sensitive child, trapped not only in a wheelchair but also in a grief that no one allows him to express. Richard felt as if he had been punched. In just one day, this woman presumed to know his son better than he did. Do you have a degree in child psychology that isn't on your resume? He asked ironically. No, Mr. Montgomery, just eyes to see and a heart to feel, Amelia replied, holding his gaze without hesitation. Leo is not just his physical condition. He is a whole person with desires, fears, and the potential to grow, despite his limitations. That night, after retiring to his room, Richard spent hours analyzing the day's recordings, watching every interaction between Amelia and his son. He found nothing explicitly suspicious. On the contrary, her dedication seemed genuine, her patience admirable, her skill with Leo almost miraculous. That was what bothered him. It seemed too good to be true. No one connected so quickly with a traumatized child. No one transformed an environment with such ease. There had to be some hidden motive, some intention that escaped his perception. Richard fell asleep in front of the computer, the image frozen on Amelia adjusting Leo's blanket, a gesture so full of affection that it was painful to watch. In his restless dreams, memories of Eleanor mingled with images of Amelia, as if the two women shared some secret to which he had no access. The next morning, he woke up determined to find out who Amelia Hayes really was and what she wanted from his family. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a month. October gave way to November, bringing with it intense rains that turned New York City into a labyrinth of umbrellas and traffic jams. In the Montgomery mansion, however, a private spring was blooming, nurtured by Amelia's presence. The transformation in Leo was evident even to the least attentive eyes. The boy still didn't speak much, but his gestures became more expressive, his gaze more alive. The physical therapy sessions, once faced with silent resistance, now had his active participation, especially when Amelia was present, encouraging every small progress with her contagious enthusiasm. Dr. Oliveira was impressed with the muscle development in his legs, Amelia commented to Richard after they returned from a medical appointment. He said the daily exercises are making a difference. Richard observed everything, with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that consumed him from within. Every night, ritualistically, he reviewed the day's recordings, searching for any sign of suspicious behavior. But what he found only intensified his inner conflict. Amelia singing lullabies when Leo had nightmares. Amelia creating games that stimulated his motor coordination. Amelia inventing stories that made the boy smile. A rare and precious smile that Richard barely recognized. On that Thursday afternoon, as the rain lashed against the mansion's windows, Richard returned early from the office, soaked despite his umbrella. As he passed through the living room, he heard something that made him stop abruptly. The sound of a child's laughter, crystal clear and genuine, a sound he hadn't heard since before Eleanor's passing. Following the sound like one follows a distant melody, he arrived at the playroom, a room rarely used in recent years. Through the crack of the ajar door, he glimpsed a scene that would be etched in his memory. Leo out of his wheelchair, sitting on a soft rug, surrounded by colorful blocks. Amelia, kneeling beside him, was stacking the blocks into an unstable tower that swayed dangerously. "It's going to fall," Leo exclaimed, in a clear voice that Richard almost didn't recognize. "Only if you huff and puff like the big bad wolf," Amelia replied, making a funny face that provoked more laughter. The boy puffed up his cheeks and blew with all his might, sending the tower crashing down in a colorful avalanche. His laughter filled the room, a music Richard never expected to hear again. For a few moments he remained motionless, fearing his presence would break the spell of that moment. An intense emotion tightened his throat, not just for his son's joy, but for the painful realization of his own absence in the construction of this happiness. Finally, he pushed the door open and entered. Leo's smile vanished instantly, replaced by the guarded expression he reserved for his father. Amelia, however, maintained her enthusiasm. "Mr. Montgomery." What a nice surprise. We were practicing motor coordination with a building game. I see, Richard replied, noticing how his son discreetly slid closer to Amelia as if seeking protection. The gesture, subtle but unmistakable, was like a stab wound. I didn't know Leo could be out of his chair for so long. Dr. Oliveira recommended short periods of exercise on the floor, always with supervision, Amelia explained. It helps strengthen his back muscles and allows him to experience different movements. Richard nodded, approaching cautiously and crouching down to be at his son's level. Looks like fun. Can I play too? The look Leo gave Amelia, asking for approval, for confirmation that it would be safe to include his father in his world, was another wound in Richard's already bruised heart. When she smiled encouragingly, the boy finally nodded his head in affirmation. For the next half hour, the three of them built and demolished towers, created imaginary castles, and invented stories for their tiny inhabitants. Richard watched, amazed, at how Amelia naturally included Leo in every decision, validating his choices, celebrating his ideas. Even more impressive was how his son responded, not just with gestures, but with complete words, short sentences that revealed a quick and imaginative mind hidden behind years of silence. When Mrs. Gable announced that dinner was served, Richard helped put Leo back in his wheelchair. During the transfer, his eyes met Amelia's, and he saw something in them he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't judgment nor pity, but a kind of expectation, as if she were waiting for an acknowledgement he wasn't yet ready to offer. That evening marked a subtle shift in the Montgomery family dynamic. During dinner, Richard asked questions directly to Leo, waiting patiently for his hesitant answers, valuing each word like the treasure it was. Afterward, he joined Amelia in the ritual of preparing his son for bed, actively participating in choosing the book for the nightly reading. Jack and the Beanstalk. Richard read the chosen title sitting on the edge of the bed. I loved this story when I was a kid. Why don't you tell it in your own words? Amelia suggested, handing him the book and preparing to leave. I'm sure Leo would love to hear it. Before she could leave the room, Leo's small hand grabbed her red dress. Stay, he pleaded, with that little voice that still sounded strange to Richard's ears. The request, simple but laden with meaning, stirred a wave of conflicting emotions in Richard. On one hand, he felt jealous of the clear connection between his son and Amelia. On the other, he recognized that this very connection was allowing Leo to emerge from his shell of silence. Of course, I'll stay, Amelia replied, sitting on the other side of the bed. That night, as he narrated the adventures of the boy who climbed a magical beanstalk to the sky, Richard felt transported back to his own childhood. He remembered his father, Arthur Montgomery, a stern man whose approval he had sought tirelessly until the last day of his life. A man who rarely smiled, who measured people's worth by their material success, who considered displays of affection signs of weakness. You're telling it wrong. Leo interrupted suddenly, when Richard got to the part where Jack met the giant. The giant says, "Fee-fee-fo-fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman." Richard blinked, surprised not only by the correction but by his son's decisive voice. You're right, he agreed, smiling. How could I forget such an important part? The look Leo gave his father, a mixture of pride for knowing something he didn't and relief at his positive reaction, warmed Richard's heart. For that brief moment, the barrier between them seemed less insurmountable. When the story ended and Leo finally fell asleep, Richard and Amelia left the room in silence. In the hallway, he stopped her with a gesture. How did you do it? He asked, keeping his voice low. In just 1 month, you've achieved what I've been trying for 2 years. Amelia faced him with those brown eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. I didn't do anything extraordinary. Mr. Montgomery, I just gave Leo what all children need: time, attention, and the certainty that their feelings are valid, even the difficult ones. He never spoke to me like that, Richard confessed, the vulnerability in his voice surprising them both. It's as if he's afraid of me. It's not fear, Amelia corrected gently. It's insecurity. Children are mirrors. They reflect what they see. If they encounter distance, they respond with distance. If they find openness, they respond with openness. Richard completed, understanding. That night, instead of reviewing the camera footage, Richard remained in his office, contemplating an old photograph. In it, his father, Arthur Montgomery, posed formally next to his wife and their 5-year-old son, Richard himself with a forced smile and eyes that pleaded for approval. He recognized, with a pang in his chest, the same look in Leo's eyes. He was repeating the pattern, passing on the legacy of emotional distance he had inherited. The realization was too painful to ignore. The next morning, while having coffee before leaving for the office, Richard saw a scene through the kitchen window that made him stop with his cup halfway to his lips. In the garden, protected by a small makeshift tent against the persistent drizzle, Amelia and Leo were feeding the birds. The boy, sitting in his wheelchair, tossed breadcrumbs to the robins and sparrows that approached cautiously. What caught Richard's attention, however, was something hanging from Amelia's neck, a gold locket that swung as she leaned over to help Leo. The jewelry reflected a ray of sunlight that broke through the clouds, sending a golden flash that momentarily blinded him. When his vision cleared, he felt an unsettling sense of déjà vu. That locket. He was sure he had seen it before. Quickly, he went up to the attic where he kept his father's belongings. Among dusty boxes, he found what he was looking for. A small carved wooden box containing the pocket watch Arthur Montgomery had carried his entire life. With trembling fingers, Richard opened the watch and examined the inner lid. There it was, the same symbol he had glimpsed on Amelia's locket, a circle with a small 5-pointed star in the center. Richard's heart raced. This couldn't be a coincidence. But what did it mean? What connection could exist between his father, a ruthless businessman who had built an empire from scratch, and Amelia Hayes, a simple woman working as a caregiver? The curiosity and suspicion, which had subsided in recent weeks, reappeared with full force. That night, Richard resumed his surveillance through the cameras with renewed interest, determined to discover what else Amelia might be hiding. The crucial moment came 3 days later, as Richard was watching the nightly recordings. It was late, everyone had retired, and he was observing Amelia checking on Leo one last time before going to her own room. The camera captured the moment she adjusted the blankets around the sleeping boy, leaned in to kiss his forehead, and whispered something that made Richard's blood run cold. "You shouldn't be in this chair, my little one." If he knew the truth about that night. Richard paused the recording, rewound a few seconds, and turned up the volume. There was no mistake, those were the exact words. What truth? What night? The trust he had begun to build in Amelia crumbled like a house of cards. His mind buzzed with theories, each more disturbing than the last. What did she know about Leo's condition that he didn't? The doctors had been clear. The boy was born with a congenital malformation of the spine that affected his movements. There was no that night or truth to be discovered, or was there? A terrible doubt began to grow inside him, fueled by a memory he had tried to suppress. On the night Eleanor went into premature labor, he was on a business trip. When he arrived at the hospital hours later, he found his father in the hallway, with a grim expression he had attributed to the stress of the moment. He had never questioned the details of that night, accepting the simplified version he was given: complications, emergency delivery, unavoidable neurological damage. Richard spent the early morning hours reviewing every available recording, obsessively watching every interaction between Amelia and Leo. He then noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. How she performed small exercises with the boy's legs, not just games but precise, almost therapeutic movements. How she hummed specific songs while massaging his muscles. How she watched his reactions intently, as if assessing progress invisible to untrained eyes. These were not the actions of a simple caregiver. They were techniques that suggested specialized, almost medical knowledge. When the sun rose, Richard had made a decision. He needed to confront Amelia, to find out what she knew and why she was in his house. But he would do it strategically, without alerting her to his suspicions. First, he would investigate the locket and its connection to his father more thoroughly. During breakfast, he watched Amelia with new eyes, noticing the gold locket partially hidden under the collar of her red uniform. "That's a nice locket," he commented casually as Mrs. Gable served coffee. "It looks old." Amelia instinctively touched the jewelry, a gesture that confirmed to Richard that the object held special meaning for her. "It was a gift from my mother," she replied with a soft smile. She said it belonged to a good man who helped us when I was little. May I see it up close? Richard asked, keeping his tone casual despite the tension he felt. With almost imperceptible hesitation, Amelia removed the chain and handed the locket to Richard. He examined it carefully, confirming his suspicion. It was identical to the symbol on his father's watch. "Interesting," he murmured, returning the jewelry. "It reminds me of something I've seen before." "My mother used to say it was a symbol of protection," Amelia explained, putting the chain back on. "The man who gave us shelter during a flood said that as long as we carried it, we would be safe." The mention of the flood struck Richard like a bolt of lightning. His father rarely spoke of good deeds, but there was one story he had repeated several times in his final years, about how he had saved a woman and a child during the Great New York Flood decades ago. Could it be that this flood, he asked, trying to control his voice. "When did it happen?" "Almost 30 years ago," Amelia replied. "I was very little. I only remember water everywhere and my mother's fear. Then the safety of a dry place and a man with a deep voice who gave me hot chocolate. 30 years. Amelia's approximate age. The timing coincided with the story his father used to tell. The one act of kindness Arthur Montgomery had ever mentioned with pride. The coincidence was too great to ignore, but it didn't explain the unsettling comment about Leo and that night. Nor did it justify Amelia's familiarity with physical therapy techniques or her particular interest in his son. At that moment, watching her interact naturally with Leo, helping him cut a piece of fruit while they talked about the birds they had fed the day before, Richard felt torn between gratitude for the good she was doing for the boy and the fear that this good concealed a potentially devastating truth. The pieces of the puzzle were there, right in front of him, but he still couldn't see the whole picture. Something crucial was missing, a connection that would explain everything. And then, like a whisper of fate, Leo knocked over his glass of juice, staining Amelia's red uniform. As she stood up to clean herself, Richard saw the small ID badge clipped to her apron pocket. An old, partially faded badge, but still legible. St. Jude's Hospital. Maternity Ward, St. Jude's Hospital. The name pierced Richard's mind like a sharp needle. It was the same hospital where Leo had been born, where Eleanor had given birth prematurely after that fateful night. The coincidence morphed into certainty. Amelia was not in his house by chance. For the rest of breakfast, he maintained a forcedly casual conversation, while his mind worked furiously, connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. The locket, the flood, the hospital, and that disturbing whisper about the wheelchair and the truth about that night. "I'm taking Leo to the park today," Amelia announced, wiping the juice stain from her uniform. "Dr. Oliveira said fresh air and contact with nature are important stimulants." "I'll go with you," Richard decided impulsively. "I'll cancel my morning appointments." The look of surprise on Leo's face was a silent accusation, a reminder of how rarely his father participated in his daily activities. Amelia, however, smiled in approval. "That would be wonderful, wouldn't it, Leo? We can take that new toy plane to test it out." The boy nodded shyly, glancing back and forth between Amelia and his father, as if trying to understand this new dynamic. While Amelia took Leo to get ready, Richard retreated to his office and made a quick call to his assistant, cancelling the meeting scheduled for that morning. Then he opened his laptop and typed quickly, "St. Jude's Hospital plus Maternity Ward plus records." He didn't expect to find anything so easily, but he had to start somewhere. To his surprise, among the search results, an old news article appeared about an investigation into irregularities at the hospital, dated 5 years ago. The article briefly mentioned suspicions of record tampering in the maternity ward, but the case had been closed due to a lack of concrete evidence. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He needed more information, but time was against him. He closed the laptop and went downstairs to find Amelia and Leo already ready in the entrance hall. Central Park was relatively empty on that Thursday morning, with only a few mothers pushing strollers and elderly people taking slow walks under the leafy trees. Amelia found a perfect spot near the lake, where she set up a small, comfortable area for Leo, with a colorful blanket on the grass and cushions to support his back. Richard watched, fascinated, as she skillfully transferred the boy from the wheelchair to the blanket, with movements that seemed rehearsed, efficient without being mechanical. "Have you worked with many children with special needs?" he asked, trying to maintain a disinterested tone as he sat down beside his son. "A few," Amelia answered vaguely, adjusting the cap on Leo's head to protect him from the sun. "Every child is unique, with their own challenges and possibilities." "At St. Jude's Hospital?" he pressed, noticing how she momentarily froze before continuing what she was doing. "Among other places," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Have you noticed my old ID badge?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. Richard nodded, studying her reactions. "An interesting coincidence. Leo was born there." Amelia finally looked at him, her brown eyes unreadable. "I know. It's in his medical file that you provided when I started working here." Before Richard could continue his subtle interrogation, Leo tugged on his shirt sleeve, pointing to the toy plane Amelia had just taken out of her bag. "Does it fly far?" the boy asked, with an expression of genuine curiosity that momentarily melted Richard's suspicions. "Let's find out," he replied, taking the toy. For a few minutes, father and son focused on adjusting the wings of the colorful plastic plane, testing different angles to maximize its flight distance. Amelia watched the interaction with an enigmatic smile, occasionally offering suggestions that showed a surprising knowledge of basic aerodynamics. When they finally launched the plane, it glided gracefully for several yards before landing softly on the grass near the lake. The expression of pure joy on Leo's face as the plane flew, eyes wide, mouth open in a perfect O of admiration, little hands clapping enthusiastically, hit Richard with unexpected force. How many moments like this had he missed, buried in his office, hiding behind work so as not to face the pain of seeing his son in that chair, a daily reminder of what he had lost. "Again," Leo requested, and Richard ran to retrieve the plane, feeling strangely light, almost like the child he had once been, before the expectations and disappointments that had hardened his heart. For the next 2 hours, the suspicions about Amelia were temporarily overshadowed by the simple joy of being with his son. They flew the plane, fed the ducks in the lake, and made up stories about the clouds passing in the blue sky. At times, Richard even managed to forget the wheelchair, seeing only the bright, sensitive boy that Leo was. When they finally returned to the mansion, exhausted but happy, Richard experienced conflicting feelings. On one hand, the morning had been one of the happiest moments he had shared with his son in years. On the other, the suspicions about Amelia remained, now heightened by her evasiveness about St. Jude's Hospital. After lunch, while Amelia supervised Leo's nap, Richard locked himself in his office and decided to continue his investigation. He called an old friend who worked in the legal department at St. Jude's Hospital. "Ricardo?" "Richard Montgomery. I need a discreet favor." He explained that he was looking for information about a former employee of the maternity ward, possibly from about 5 years ago. He mentioned Amelia Hayes's name and waited, listening to the sound of keys being pressed on the other end of the line. "We have an Amelia Hayes on record, yes," Ricardo confirmed after a few minutes. "She worked as a nursing assistant in the maternity ward for 5 years, leaving, let's see, about 4.5 years ago." Richard's heart sped up. "Any information on the reason for her departure?" "Let me check. Apparently, she resigned voluntarily. There are no records of disciplinary issues or complaints." "Is there any way to know if she was on duty in the maternity ward on a specific date?" "Say it June 15th, 5 years ago. The date of Leo's birth." Richard could almost feel the pieces of the puzzle moving, seeking to fit together. "I can check the old schedules, but it would take time," Ricardo replied. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Richard?" "A problem with your son?" The question caught him off guard. "No, just verifying some information to complete his medical history. You know how these things are." The explanation sounded weak even to his own ears, but Ricardo didn't press. "I'll see what I can find and get back to you." After hanging up, Richard remained motionless for long minutes, contemplating the implications of what he had discovered. Amelia had worked at the hospital where Leo was born, exactly during the relevant period. It couldn't be a coincidence, especially considering her whispered comment about the wheelchair. He decided he needed to investigate more deeply but cautiously. If Amelia sensed his suspicions, she might disappear before he discovered the full truth. And despite everything, He couldn't ignore the good she was doing for Leo. His son had never been as happy and active as in the past few weeks. In the days that followed, Richard adopted a dual strategy. On one hand, he became more involved in the family routine, joining Amelia and Leo on outings and activities, observing their interaction with more attentive eyes. On the other, he intensified his investigation behind the scenes, searching for any information about Amelia's past and her possible connection to his family. A week after the visit to the park, Ricardo finally called him back. "Richard, I found something that might interest you," he said with a note of hesitation in his voice. "Amelia Hayes was indeed on duty the night your son was born. In fact, according to the records, she was one of the assistants who attended the birth." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Amelia hadn't just worked at the hospital. She had been present at Leo's birth. This explained her knowledge of the boy's condition, but raised even more disturbing questions. "One more thing," Ricardo continued. "Remember that investigation into irregularities that was closed? Amelia Hayes was one of the employees who reported suspicions of tampering with birth records. The complaint didn't go anywhere due to lack of concrete evidence, but she resigned shortly after." Richard's world seemed to spin. Tampering with birth records. The phrase echoed in his mind like a deafening alarm. He mechanically thanked Ricardo and hung up, trying to breathe through the anxiety that tightened his chest. He needed more information, more certainty before confronting Amelia directly. He decided to check the original documents from Leo's birth, kept in the safe built into his office wall. After entering the combination, he pulled out the brown leather folder containing certificates, exams, and medical reports. The birth certificate seemed normal at first glance: date, time, weight, height. Leo's condition was documented in precise medical terms: congenital malformation of the spinal column, resulting in motor impairment of the lower limbs. The diagnosis had been signed by Dr. Robert Miller, head of the medical team responsible for the delivery. Richard spent hours reviewing each document, looking for inconsistencies or signs of tampering. He found nothing obviously suspicious, but a persistent unease accompanied him when he finally decided to call it a night. As he put the documents away, he noticed an envelope he didn't remember seeing before, partially hidden under other folders in the safe. It bore the St. Jude's Hospital logo and was addressed to his father, Arthur Montgomery. Intrigued, he opened it and found a brief letter from Dr. Miller, dated 1 week after Leo's birth. "Dear Mr. Montgomery, as requested, I'm forwarding the finalized documents regarding the procedure we discussed. All arrangements have been made according to your instructions, and the official records reflect the agreed-upon situation. The payment has been received in full. I reiterate that this matter must remain strictly between us for the reasons we discussed in person. Sincerely, Dr. Robert Miller." Richard read the letter 3 times, his mind initially refusing to process the implications of those carefully chosen words. What procedure had his father discussed with the doctor? What agreed-upon situation did the official records reflect? And most disturbingly, what payment had been received? The terrible doubt that had begun to form days ago now took on a more defined, more threatening shape. Could his father, a man known for manipulating situations and people to achieve his goals, have interfered in some way with Leo's birth? Richard put the letter away with trembling hands and left the office, feeling the need to see his son. He walked silently to Leo's room and opened the door a crack. The lamplight cast soft shadows on the walls, decorated with the colorful drawings that Amelia and the boy had created together in recent weeks. Leo was sleeping peacefully, one of his arms resting on the blanket, the other hand firmly clutching the toy plane they had launched in the park. His face, relaxed in sleep, had features that resembled Eleanor's: the gentle curve of his eyebrows, the delicate shape of his chin. As he watched his sleeping son, Richard was overcome by a wave of love so intense it almost knocked him over. It didn't matter what mystery lay behind his birth, what secrets Amelia might be hiding, or what manipulations his father might have orchestrated. Leo was his son, the light of his life, even if he himself had taken so long to recognize that truth. He closed the door silently and turned to return to his room, only to find Amelia standing in the hallway, watching him with an unreadable expression. "He sleeps peacefully now," she commented softly. "The nightmares have lessened." Thanks to you, Richard acknowledged, studying her face in the dim light of the hallway. Not just me. Your more constant presence has made a huge difference. For a moment they stood in silence like opponents sizing each other up before an inevitable confrontation. Why are you really here, Amelia? Richard finally asked, deciding he could no longer postpone this conversation. And don't tell me it's just for the job. She showed no surprise at the direct question, as if she had been waiting for this moment for weeks. I'm here because Leo deserves to know the truth, she replied simply. And because I've carried this knowledge alone for too long. What truth? About how he really ended up in that chair? About the night he was born? Richard's heart raced. What do you know? Amelia hesitated, as if carefully measuring her next words. I know that your son was not born with that condition. I know that the medical records were altered. And I know that your father was behind it. The statement, though expected after his recent discoveries, still hit him with devastating force. Richard took a step back, leaning against the hallway wall. How can you prove that? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I was there, Amelia replied. I saw both babies. Both babies, Richard repeated, feeling the world crumble around him. Amelia's gaze softened, a mix of determination and compassion. This conversation is too long for a dark hallway. Mr. Montgomery, and I need to show you something I've carried with me for years, waiting for the right moment. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked towards her own room, leaving Richard with the terrible feeling that, whatever truth he was about to discover, nothing in his life would ever be the same. Amelia's room was simple but welcoming. Unlike the austere formality that characterized the rest of the mansion, this small space reflected the personality of its occupant. Warm colors on the handmade cushions, photographs of landscapes on the walls, books organized on a small makeshift bookshelf. In a corner on the dresser, Richard noticed a picture frame with the image of a smiling young man he presumed was the brother she had mentioned losing. Please, have a seat, Amelia said, gesturing to the only armchair in the room while she sat on the edge of the bed. Richard obeyed mechanically, his thoughts still processing the statement about two babies. He watched in silence as Amelia opened the drawer of her nightstand and took out an envelope, yellowed with age. Before I show you this, I need you to understand a few things, she began, holding the envelope with both hands, as if it weighed much more than it appeared. I didn't come to your house with the intention of causing harm or seeking revenge. I came because I've carried this secret for too long, and because Leo deserves a chance that only you can give him. What chance? Richard asked, his voice harsher than he intended. The chance to walk again. The words hung in the air between them, laden with implications Richard could barely process. He felt his throat tighten. Explain, he demanded. Amelia took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep, turbulent waters. 5 years ago, I worked as a nursing assistant in the maternity ward at St. Jude's Hospital. I was on duty the night your wife was admitted after a fall. Eleanor fell down the stairs at home, Richard confirmed, remembering the explanation he had received when he finally arrived at the hospital, hours after his son's birth. It was an accident. A shadow passed over Amelia's face. It wasn't quite like that, she murmured. But we'll get back to that. The important thing is that she went into premature labor, and the emergency team acted quickly. I was in D.C., Richard said, the old guilt resurfacing. An important meeting with investors. I arrived too late. Your father was at the hospital from the beginning, Amelia continued. He made all the decisions in your absence. He was the one who authorized procedures, signed documents, spoke with the doctors. Richard already knew this. Arthur Montgomery, always in control, had naturally taken charge of the situation while his son was away. At the time, Richard had even felt grateful for his father's presence of mind in such a critical moment. The delivery was complicated, Amelia went on, but contrary to what you were told later, your son was born perfectly healthy, with no physical condition, no problem with his spine, nothing. Richard felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. That's impossible. All the medical reports were falsified, Amelia interrupted firmly, at your father's request with the complicity of Dr. Miller. Why would my father do something like that? Richard asked, though a part of him already suspected the answer. The letter in the safe, the procedure discussed, the payment received. For revenge, Amelia replied simply. Revenge against your wife. The words pierced Richard's heart like shards of glass. His father had never hidden his displeasure with his son's choice of wife. Eleanor, the daughter of teachers with no fortune or important social connections, represented a threat to the business dynasty Arthur Montgomery had built with such effort. For years he had tried to separate them with veiled threats and manipulations, failing miserably in the face of the genuine love that united the couple. That same night, Amelia continued, her voice now almost a whisper, another woman gave birth at St. Jude's Hospital, a young single mother with no resources, who had suffered complications during her pregnancy. Her baby was born with a congenital malformation of the spine, the same condition Leo supposedly has. Richard closed his eyes, a growing nausea overwhelming him as he began to understand what Amelia was suggesting. Your father bribed Dr. Miller to switch the babies, she finally said, the words falling like stones into a bottomless well. Eleanor's healthy son was sent for adoption, while you received the other baby, the one with the disability, as your biological son. No, Richard protested, standing up abruptly. That's absurd, monstrous. My father was a hard, calculating man. But he wouldn't be capable of— He was capable, Amelia stated with a certainty that froze the words of protest in Richard's throat. And he did it to punish your wife for defying his authority, for contaminating the Montgomery blood with her humble origins, to ensure that she would see the price of her disobedience every day in the form of a son who would never walk. Richard felt his legs weaken and sat down heavily in the armchair again. Memories he had suppressed began to resurface, his father's strange behavior after Leo's birth, the insistence on hiring specific specialists, the way he seemed to watch his grandson's development with an almost scientific interest, as if studying the results of an experiment. How did you find this out? He finally asked, his voice unrecognizable even to himself. Amelia opened the envelope she was holding and handed its contents to Richard, a few old photographs and a folded document. I was on duty that night, she explained. I was assigned to assist in the nursery. I saw the original records before they were altered. I saw both babies, and a few weeks later, when I started noticing discrepancies in the charts, I confronted one of the older nurses who confided her suspicions to me. Richard examined the photographs with trembling hands. The first showed two newborns side by side in the nursery, with identification tags on their wrists. The second was a blurry image of his father talking to Dr. Miller in a hallway, exchanging what looked like an envelope. The third, most devastating, showed a page from a logbook with information crossed out and rewritten by hand. This doesn't prove anything, he said, though he felt he was clinging to a comfortable lie that was rapidly falling apart. The document is more conclusive, Amelia replied softly. It's a copy of Eleanor's original delivery report before the alterations. Comparing it with what's in the official records, the differences are obvious. Richard unfolded the paper with fingers that barely obeyed. It was a standard medical report, but what caught his attention was the clear notation at the end. Newborn male, weight 6 lbs 4 oz, length 19 inches, all health parameters within normal range, no congenital malformations observed. No congenital malformations observed. The words seemed to scream from the page, confirming the unthinkable. Why didn't you report this at the time? He asked, his voice trembling with contained emotion. I tried, Amelia answered, the old hurt evident in her voice. I went to the hospital administration. I brought my suspicions, but who would listen to a novice nursing assistant against the powerful Arthur Montgomery and a respected doctor like Dr. Miller? They suggested I was imagining things, that I was confusing the cases. When I insisted, I was transferred to another department. And when I continued to investigate on my own, I received veiled threats. Richard knew well the extent of his father's influence. He knew what he would be capable of to silence accusations. And the other woman? He asked. The mother of the baby with the malformation? Did she never suspect? A look of deep sadness crossed Amelia's face. Sarah Dean, single, 22, first pregnancy. She had suffered complications during gestation and had been informed of the possibility of developmental problems in the baby. When they told her that her son was born perfectly healthy, it was like a miracle to her. Why would she question it? And what happened to her? To my real son? The question came out as a pained whisper. Sarah received generous financial assistance from a charitable foundation to raise the baby. In reality, another of your father's arrangements to ensure her unwitting silence. She moved to another part of the country, from what I could find out. As for the baby, your true biological son. Amelia hesitated, and Richard realized she was fighting back tears. I tried to find them for years, she finally continued. After your father passed away, I thought it would be safer. I tracked records, hired private investigators with what little I could save. I found out that Sarah and the boy lived in Denver for a few years, then in Portland. The last record I found was from 4 years ago, when she was working as a secretary at a medical clinic. And the boy? Richard insisted, unable to contain his eagerness to know about the son he had never met. Gabriel. She named him Gabriel. According to the school records I managed to access, he was an excellent student, especially talented in math. Gabriel, a name Eleanor had loved, one they had discussed during the pregnancy. A coincidence that seemed too cruel. Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of long-buried truths, now exposed to the relentless light of revelation. Richard felt numb, unable to fully process the implications of what he had discovered. A biological son he had never known, growing up far away. And Leo, he murmured, the thought escaping aloud. He's not biologically, no, Amelia completed gently. But in every way that truly matters, he is your son, Mr. Montgomery. Blood is only a small part of what makes a family. Richard looked up, meeting Amelia's compassionate gaze. Why are you telling me this now? Why not before? Why take the job? Come into my house, form a bond with Leo, only to destroy everything with this revelation. It was the question of a hurt, confused man, trying to find someone to blame for the pain that consumed him. Because Leo deserves a chance, she answered, with a simplicity that disarmed Richard's nascent anger. Because I believe his condition can be improved with proper treatment. And because you deserve to know the truth, however painful it might be. What truth? Richard echoed bitterly. That my father was a monster capable of swapping babies to satisfy his wounded pride. That I've spent 5 years raising a son who is not my blood. That my real son is out there not knowing who he really is. The truth that you loved Leo even without knowing, even while fighting against that love, Amelia replied, her voice firm despite the emotion. The truth that he returns that love, even when you keep your distance. The truth that family goes far beyond DNA, Mr. Montgomery. The words hit Richard like a wave, washing away his anger and leaving only the raw pain of realization. He loved Leo. He loved his rare smile, his quiet intelligence, his resilience in the face of his limitations. He loved the way his eyes lit up when he managed to complete a difficult task, the way his small hand sought his, on the rare occasions he let his guard down. And if the boy didn't share his blood, did that change this love? What do you want from me? He finally asked, exhausted. I want you to give Leo the treatment he deserves, Amelia answered. Not as an obligation to someone else's child, but as the commitment to the child you have raised as your own. And I want you to consider the possibility of finding Gabriel, your biological son, not to replace Leo, but to complete the circle of truth and healing that you all deserve. Richard ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of every word, every revelation. His mind oscillated between denial and acceptance, between anger at his deceased father and fear of the uncertain future that lay before him. I need time, he finally said. I need to think, to process all of this. I understand, Amelia nodded. But I'd like you to know one more thing before you go. Richard looked up, emotionally drained but still curious. The locket I wear, she continued, touching the jewelry on her neck. The man who helped us during the flood, who gave it to my mother as a symbol of protection, was your father. The revelation, smaller in comparison to the previous ones, still caught him off guard. My father? But that doesn't make sense. He was never the type. Complex people sometimes do contradictory things, Amelia interrupted gently. My mother always described that day as the moment a stranger showed unexpected kindness. I don't know what motivated your father at that specific moment. But I know he saved our lives, and yet, you came here to expose the evil he did, Richard observed without accusation, merely stating the paradox. I came here to right a wrong, Amelia corrected, to give Leo and Gabriel the lives they should have had, and perhaps to offer you the chance to be the kind of man your father never managed to be, someone capable of loving unconditionally, of doing the right thing even when it's hard. Richard stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. I have to go, he murmured, handing the photographs and the document back to Amelia. Keep them, she insisted. They're copies, in case you need time to examine them, to reflect. He nodded mechanically, putting the papers in his pocket, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. What did you say to Leo that night about him not deserving to be in the chair? Amelia held his gaze without hesitation. The truth, that he wasn't born for that limitation, that with proper treatment, with faith and perseverance, he could overcome much of what ties him to that chair. That the exercises we do every day are more than just games. They are steps towards the possibility that one day he will walk, even if with support. Do you really believe that? Richard asked, a thread of hope permeating his exhausted voice. With all my heart, Amelia replied. I've already seen progress that doctors would consider unlikely. Leo's condition is serious, but not irremediable as they made you believe. With the right specialists, with constant dedication, there is hope, Mr. Montgomery. Hope. A word that had had no place in his vocabulary for so long that it sounded almost like a foreign language. Hope for Leo. Hope for a family that could be rebuilt on painful, but liberating truths. Thank you, he said simply, before leaving for the longest night of his life, carrying the weight of revelations that would forever change the course of their lives. The dawn found Richard still awake, sitting in his office before the documents Amelia had given him. The bottle of whiskey remained untouched beside him. He had considered numbing his mind with alcohol, but had decided he needed absolute clarity to face the newly discovered truths. The photographs, the original medical report, his father's letter to Dr. Miller, all the pieces of the puzzle now fit together into a terrible but undeniable picture. His father, in a calculated act of cruelty, had orchestrated the baby swap, condemning an innocent child to a life of physical limitations, just to punish Eleanor for daring to defy his authority. The pain of betrayal mingled with a corrosive anger that had nowhere to go. His father was no longer alive to face the consequences of his actions. The question that now consumed him was, what to do with this truth? Richard stood up and walked to the window, watching the first light of morning tinge the New York skyline. Somewhere in this vast country, a boy named Gabriel was living his life, unaware that he was the biological son of Richard Montgomery. A boy talented in math, according to Amelia, a boy who carried the Montgomery blood and Eleanor's love in his veins, without ever having known either of them. And here, sleeping in a nearby room, was Leo, not his biological son, but the child he had raised for 5 years, the child Eleanor had loved as her own, the child who, despite the emotional distance Richard had imposed between them, still desperately sought his love and approval. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, Richard had made his decision. Blood didn't matter. Leo was his son in every way that truly mattered. And Gabriel was too, even though they had never met. From that day forward, he would dedicate his life to correcting his father's mistakes, to offering both boys the lives they deserved. He took a quick shower, changed his clothes, and went down to the kitchen, where he found Mrs. Gable preparing breakfast. "Good morning, sir," she greeted, surprised to see him up so early. "Breakfast is almost ready." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Is Amelia awake yet?" "Yes, sir. She's helping Leo with his bath." Richard nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee as he waited. Minutes later, he heard the familiar sound of the wheelchair in the hallway. Leo entered the kitchen, pushing himself, a skill he had recently developed under Amelia's patient guidance, who followed a few steps behind. "Good morning, son," Richard greeted, leaning down to kiss the top of the boy's head. Leo looked at his father with evident surprise. Richard rarely had breakfast with him, and the kiss was an even more unusual display of affection. "Good morning, Dad," he replied, his small voice cautious but hopeful. Amelia watched the interaction with a neutral expression, though her eyes betrayed her curiosity about how Richard had processed the previous night's revelations. "Good morning, Amelia," he greeted formally. "After breakfast, I'd like to speak with you in my office, if possible." "Certainly, Mr. Montgomery," she replied, helping Leo position himself at the table. Breakfast proceeded with a forced normality. Richard asked about the plans for the day, listened attentively as Leo described, with growing enthusiasm, the rocket model Amelia had promised to help him build, and even suggested they could test it together in the garden later. When they finished, Mrs. Gable took over supervising Leo, who was taken to begin his morning educational activities with the private tutor, who came 3 times a week. Richard gave a discreet signal to Amelia, and they both headed to the office in silence. Once inside the room, with the door closed to ensure privacy, Richard wasted no time on pleasantries. "I believe you," he declared, his voice firm despite the contained emotion. "I spent the night checking everything, connecting dots I had deliberately ignored before. The truth is too clear to be denied." Amelia nodded, showing no surprise or triumph, just a quiet relief, as if an enormous weight had been partially lifted from her shoulders. "What do you plan to do now?" she asked simply. "First, I want you to tell me everything about Leo's real condition," Richard replied, sitting behind his desk and indicating the chair opposite for Amelia. "You mentioned that with proper treatment, he could improve significantly. I want to know exactly what that means." Amelia sat down, adjusting her red uniform before beginning her explanation. "Leo's condition is a moderate form of spina bifida, which affects the development of the spinal column and spinal cord. It's serious, but not as severe as they led you to believe. The doctors your father chose, specifically selected by Dr. Miller, deliberately painted a more pessimistic picture, recommending conservative treatments that basically accepted the wheelchair as a permanent fate." "And it's not?" Richard asked, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "Not necessarily," Amelia replied. "I know specialists who have achieved remarkable results with cases similar to Leo's. By combining intensive physical therapy, neuromuscular stimulation, aquatic therapy, and possibly specific corrective surgical procedures, there is a real possibility that he could develop independent mobility, perhaps with aids like crutches or walkers initially, but who knows one day." "Without a wheelchair," Richard completed, almost unable to believe the possibility. "I can't promise that," Amelia warned honestly. "Every case is unique, and the time lost following an inadequate treatment plan didn't help. But the exercises I've been doing with him these past few weeks are already showing promising results. Increased sensation in his legs, muscle strengthening, better control of his movements. These are encouraging signs." Richard nodded, absorbing the information with a mixture of hope and determination. "Second point," he continued after a moment of reflection, "I want to find Gabriel." The name of the son he had never met sounded strange on his lips, laden with possibilities and regrets. "I have some leads," Amelia offered. "The last address I was able to track was in Portland, but that was 4 years ago. With your resources, I believe it would be possible to find them quickly." "I'll hire the best private investigators," Richard decided. "Discreet, respectful, but efficient." "And when you find them?" Amelia asked cautiously. "What's your plan?" The question caught Richard off guard. In truth, he hadn't thought much beyond the primary desire to find his biological son. What would he say to him? How would he explain the situation without destroying the life he had built with Sarah Dean? "I don't know exactly," he admitted honestly, "but I know I want to meet him. I want to offer him the opportunities he deserves, the support I can give. Not to take him from the mother who raised him, but to add, not subtract." Amelia studied Richard's face for a long moment before nodding, seemingly satisfied with the sincerity of his answer. "And what about Leo?" she finally asked. "Are you going to tell him?" The most difficult question of all. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where his son, yes, his son, regardless of biology, used to play. Not now, he finally decided. He's too young to understand the complexity of this situation. But one day, when he's older, when he has enough emotional security to process this truth, yes, I believe he deserves to know. But it will be told as a story of love, not betrayal. A story about how families are formed by the heart, not just by blood. A small smile appeared on Amelia's lips, the first genuine smile since the beginning of their conversation. "Will you stay?" Richard asked, turning to face her. "Now that you've fulfilled your mission of revealing the truth." "If you'll have me, I would very much like to continue," she replied. "Not just for Leo's sake, although he is my main concern, but because I feel I still have a role to play in this story. Besides," she hesitated, as if weighing her next words, "I believe you will also need support in the days to come." Richard had never been a man who easily accepted help or showed vulnerability, but the events of the last 24 hours had profoundly shaken his certainties. He now recognized that he would need allies to navigate the complex path ahead. "I appreciate that," he said simply. In the days that followed, Richard implemented the changes he had decided upon with the methodical efficiency that characterized him in business. First, he scheduled consultations with the country's top specialists in spina bifida, seeking second, third, and even fourth opinions on the real possibilities of treatment for Leo. The consensus that emerged from these consultations confirmed what Amelia had said. While Leo's condition was definitely serious, it had been treated with excessive conservatism that limited his potential for improvement. With an intensive treatment program, there was real hope for significant progress. In parallel, he hired a renowned investigative agency to locate Sarah, Dean, and Gabriel. He provided all the information Amelia had and instructed the investigators to proceed with the utmost discretion. Most importantly, Richard completely transformed his relationship with Leo. He reorganized his work schedule, delegating responsibilities and reducing travel to be able to spend more time at home. Every morning began with breakfast together. The evenings ended with shared reading sessions. On weekends, they explored new places together that were adapted for the wheelchair: museums, parks, cultural centers. Amelia observed this transformation with a mix of satisfaction and caution. While she was genuinely happy with the new dynamic between father and son, she worried about what would happen when Gabriel was found, when the inevitable complications of this revelation would hit the fragile happiness they were beginning to build. On one particularly significant afternoon, about a month after the revelation, Richard came home earlier than usual, carrying a mysterious box. He found Leo and Amelia in the physical therapy room he had had specially equipped for his son's intensive treatment. "How was the session today?" he asked, watching Leo lie on a specialized mat with small electrodes attached to his legs for muscle stimulation. "Excellent," Amelia replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Leo managed to hold a voluntary contraction for almost 10 seconds today. A record." The boy smiled, proud of his progress. Lately, with the combination of intensive therapies and the constant encouragement from Richard and Amelia, his attitude towards his own condition had changed drastically. Where there was once silent resignation, there was now determination and hope. "I have a surprise for both of you," Richard announced, placing the box on the floor and kneeling beside Leo. "Something I think will help with our project." "What project?" Leo asked curiously, trying to peek inside the box. "Project Steps," Richard replied with a smile, using the name they had created together for the rehabilitation program. "Look!" From inside the box, he pulled out a pair of modern orthoses, special leg braces, made of a light and resistant material, designed to provide stability and assist with movement. "They're beautiful," Amelia exclaimed, examining the pieces with an expert eye. "And they seem perfectly fitted." "They were custom-made, based on the specifications Dr. Camacho sent," Richard explained, referring to the new orthopedist overseeing Leo's treatment. "He believes that with these, and with the parallel bars being installed in the garden tomorrow, we can start practicing standing and maybe even some assisted steps." Leo's eyes widened, shining with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm going to stand up?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're going to try," Richard replied cautiously, following the doctor's advice not to create unrealistic expectations. "It will be a slow process, with many small steps before the big ones. But we're in this together, chap, all of us." That night, after Leo had fallen asleep, exhausted but happy with the new possibilities opening up, Richard found Amelia on the back porch, contemplating the garden where the parallel bars would be installed. "Thank you," he said, stopping beside her, "for everything. For not giving up on him. For showing me the truth, however painful it was." Amelia turned to face him, the soft moonlight highlighting her delicate features. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. Many times I thought about giving up, about letting the past stay buried, but then I would remember those two babies, and the terrible mistake that changed their destinies, and I knew I had to keep going. You have an extraordinary heart, Richard observed, surprising himself with the sincerity of the compliment. A comfortable silence settled between them, a truce in the tension that had characterized their first months of living together. It was almost possible to imagine they were just two people sharing a pleasant evening, without the weight of the secrets and painful truths that had brought them together. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Richard's phone. He checked the number and his heart raced. It was the lead investigator responsible for the search for Gabriel and Sarah. "I have to take this," he murmured, stepping a few feet away. Amelia nodded, respecting his privacy, but remained nearby intuitively, sensing the importance of the call. The conversation was brief, but when Richard hung up, his expression revealed a complex mix of emotions: relief, fear, hope, apprehension. "They've been found," he announced, his voice slightly trembling. "Gabriel and Sarah are living in Charleston. He's almost 6 in the first grade. Apparently they're doing well, stable." "That's wonderful," Amelia replied softly. "What are you going to do now?" Richard took a deep breath, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a heavy cloud. "I'm going to Charleston tomorrow," he decided. "I need to see him, even if from a distance at first. Then I need to find a way to approach Sarah, to explain the unexplainable without destroying the life they've built." "Do you want me to go with you?" Amelia offered. "I can help explain, fill in details you might not know." The offer surprised Richard. He realized, not for the first time, how Amelia had become an integral part of his and Leo's lives, not just an employee or even an ally, but almost family. "I appreciate the offer," he replied sincerely, "but I think this first contact needs to be just between me and them. Besides, Leo needs you here. I don't want to interrupt his treatment routine right when we're seeing progress." Amelia nodded, understanding. "Be careful with your expectations, Richard," she advised, using his first name for the first time. "To Gabriel, you'll be a stranger. To Sarah, possibly a threat to the only world she knows with her son." "I know," he agreed. "I will proceed with extreme caution. I have no intention of causing harm, only of opening a door to possibilities that will benefit everyone, especially Gabriel." That night, as he packed a small bag for the next day's trip, Richard was overcome with an anxiety he hadn't felt since the early days after Eleanor's passing. Was he doing the right thing, or would his quest for redemption and connection end up causing more pain than healing? Before going to sleep, he stopped by Leo's room watching his sleeping son, his small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Regardless of what happened in Charleston, this boy was and always would be his son. The revelation about Gabriel didn't change that. It just expanded the circle of his heart to include another innocent child, a victim of Arthur Montgomery's machinations. "I'll be back soon," he whispered, adjusting the blanket around Leo's small shoulders. "And when I get back, we'll continue our project. One step at a time, remember?" The next morning, as the driver prepared the car to take him to the airport, Richard hugged Leo with unusual force. "Be good for Amelia," he instructed, ruffling his son's hair. "Keep up with your exercises, even when you're tired. I'm proud of you, you know that." Leo nodded solemnly, his big green eyes fixed on his father. "Will you be gone long?" "Just a few days," Richard promised. "And I'll bring back presents." The boy smiled, satisfied with the promise. Richard then turned to Amelia, who was watching the farewell with a serene expression. "Call me if anything happens," he instructed. "Dr. Camacho is coming tomorrow for the monthly evaluation. His numbers and the clinics are on my desk." "We'll take care of everything," Amelia assured him. "Focus on what you need to do there. We'll be here when you get back." There was something in her tone, a quiet certainty, an implicit promise that calmed Richard's anxiety. With a final wave to Leo, he got into the car and left for the airport, heading towards a meeting that could rewrite the future of two families bound by an old, cruel secret. Charleston greeted Richard with a crystal-clear blue sky and a sea breeze that carried promises of new beginnings. From the taxi taking him from the airport to his hotel in the city center, he looked at the landscapes of the historic city with eyes that didn't truly see. His mind was focused on the imminent meeting that could change everything. According to the investigators' information, Gabriel attended a local elementary school, and Sarah worked as a receptionist at a nearby dental clinic. Richard's initial plan was simple: to observe discreetly from a distance just to confirm that it was indeed his biological son, before planning any direct approach. After dropping his luggage at the hotel, he drove to the indicated school. He parked across the street, feeling simultaneously like an intruder and someone who had every right to be there. The clock read 4:30 p.m., dismissal time as he had discovered. Soon the gates opened and children began to pour out in small groups, some accompanied by parents, others leaving on their own. Richard scanned each little face with almost painful attention, his heart racing with every brown-haired boy who appeared. And then he saw him. He didn't need the file of photographs the investigators had provided. Something in his blood, in his heart, instantly recognized that specific child among all the others. Gabriel, wore the school's blue uniform, carried a backpack with prints of planets and stars, and was chatting animatedly with another boy as he walked out of the gates. The resemblance to Eleanor was striking, the same expressive eyes, the same shape of the face. Even the smile had that slightly crooked corner that had always enchanted him in his wife. But there were traces of the Montgomerys, too. Undeniable to anyone who knew where to look. The determined chin, the way he tilted his head slightly when he spoke, gestures Richard recognized from his own childhood photographs. Without realizing it, Richard got out of the car and took a few steps closer, as if pulled by an invisible force. He stopped, however, when he saw a woman of about 30, with dark hair tied in a simple ponytail, approaching Gabriel with a warm smile. Sarah Dean looked exactly like what she was, a dedicated, hard-working mother, visibly tired after a long day, but who lit up at the sight of her son. She crouched down to receive Gabriel's enthusiastic hug, listening intently as the boy told her something that seemed very important. Judging by his expansive gestures, Richard remained motionless, taking in the scene with conflicting emotions. He had imagined this moment for weeks, mentally rehearsed approaches and explanations, but now, confronted with the reality of these two human beings, whose lives he could completely destabilize, he felt paralyzed by the responsibility. He followed them discreetly, watching as they walked hand in hand to a nearby bus stop, how Gabriel jumped excitedly around his mother, how she constantly adjusted the backpack, slipping from his small shoulder. They were everyday gestures, even mundane, but filled with an intimacy and love that were almost painful to witness. For the next 2 days, Richard maintained this respectful surveillance from a distance. He discovered they lived in a modest apartment in a residential complex near the beach. He watched Gabriel play in the condominium's playground after school, saw Sarah leave early for work and return in the late afternoon. He noticed how sociable the boy was, always surrounded by friends, how he gestured expressively when he spoke, another trait he recognized from Eleanor. On the evening of the 3rd day, sitting on the hotel terrace overlooking the sea, Richard made his decision. The approach he had initially planned, formally introducing himself to Sarah, explaining the situation, possibly involving lawyers to establish legal rights, now seemed cold and inadequate in the face of what he had witnessed. Gabriel and Sarah had an established life, a routine, a community. His intervention, if mishandled, could cause more harm than good. The truth needed to be revealed, yes. Gabriel deserved to know his origin, deserved the connection to his true history, deserved the resources and opportunities Richard could provide. But it would have to happen organically, respecting the bonds that already existed, honoring Sarah's role as a mother in every sense that truly mattered. The next morning, after a night of deep reflection, Richard did something he had never imagined doing. He sat at a table in the cafe where Sarah usually had a quick coffee before work, and he waited. When she entered, punctual as on all previous days, he took a deep breath, gathering all his courage. "Excuse me, Miss Sarah Dean," he asked, approaching her table after she had placed her order. Her eyes, brown and cautious, met his with surprise. "Yes," she replied, clearly confused as to how this stranger in a well-tailored suit knew her name. "My name is Richard Montgomery," he introduced himself, keeping his voice calm despite his racing heart. "I know this will sound strange, but we need to talk about something very important. About Gabriel." The name of her son acted as an instant alarm. Sarah paled, her fingers nervously tightening around her coffee cup. "Who are you? What do you want with my son?" she asked, her tone as defensive as a lioness protecting her cub. "Please," Richard pleaded, maintaining a respectful distance. "I am not a threat, but I have crucial information that affects both Gabriel and you. Information you have the right to know." Over the next hour, in a tense and emotionally charged conversation, Richard explained everything: the baby swap, his father's manipulation, the recent discovery through Amelia. He showed the evidence he had brought: photographs, medical reports, the results of a DNA test he had secretly conducted with a toothbrush the investigators had managed to get from Sarah's apartment trash. Initially incredulous, then horrified and finally devastated, Sarah listened to everything in silence, silent tears streaming down her face as the terrible truth unfolded before her. "Gabriel is not my biological son?" she finally murmured, her voice broken. "All this time?" "Biologically, no," Richard confirmed gently. "But in every other aspect, love, dedication, upbringing, you are the only mother he has ever known or needed." "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, finally finding her voice. "Did you come to take him away? To destroy our life?" The question, laden with fear and pain, struck Richard deeply. It was the same fear he himself had felt when contemplating the possibility of losing Leo to his real family. "No," he answered firmly. "I didn't come to separate you or to cause pain. I came because I believe Gabriel deserves to know his full story when it's appropriate. I came because I want to offer him the opportunities I can provide, like education, medical care, financial security, not to replace what you give him, but to complement it." "And Leo?" Sarah asked, surprising Richard with her immediate concern for the other child involved in this story. "How is he?" With a lump in his throat, Richard described Leo, his condition, his recent progress with the new treatment. He told her about Amelia, her role in uncovering the truth, her dedication to the boy's well-being. "I want them to meet," he finally admitted. "Not to force a relationship, but to give both of them a chance to understand that family can have many forms, many connections. I want Gabriel to know he has a place in our lives, if and when he wants to take it, without ever losing the place he has with you." Sarah remained silent for long minutes, processing everything she had heard. When she finally spoke, her voice was firmer, though still filled with emotion. "I need time," she said. "I need to think about what's best for Gabriel. He is my world, Richard. From the first moment I held him in my arms, when they told me that miraculously he had been born healthy despite all the problems during the pregnancy, he has been everything to me." "I completely understand," Richard replied, "and I respect your need for time. I won't do anything without your consent, but I would like to leave my contact information and maybe we could talk again before I return to New York." In the days that followed, Richard kept his distance, respecting Sarah's space to process the shocking truth. He kept in daily contact with Amelia, receiving updates on Leo, on his progress in physical therapy sessions, on the small milestones he continued to achieve in his absence. "He managed to stand at the parallel bars for almost a full minute today," Amelia said, excitement evident in her voice during a video call. "Dr. Camacho was impressed with his muscles strengthening in such a short time." "Tell him I'm proud," Richard replied, feeling a pang of guilt for not being there to witness that important moment. "I'll be back soon to celebrate together." On the eve of his scheduled return to New York, Richard received an unexpected message from Sarah, asking to meet at the park near her apartment. When he arrived at the designated spot, he found her sitting on a bench, watching Gabriel play on the playground with other children. "He looks happy," Richard commented, sitting beside her after receiving her permission. "He is," Sarah confirmed, "and I want him to stay that way no matter what happens." She turned to face Richard, her eyes now dry and determined. "I've thought a lot about everything you told me. I consulted a psychologist, trying to understand the best way to handle this, and I've come to some conclusions." "I'm listening," he replied, respecting her strength in the face of such extraordinary circumstances. "Gabriel is my son," she declared firmly. "Nothing will change that. No DNA test, no revelation about his birth. I was the one who held his hand during his first steps, who wiped his tears when he fell, who celebrated every small victory. Richard nodded, understanding the sentiment perfectly. But, she continued, her voice softening, I also know he deserves more than I can give him alone. He deserves to know his full story, when he's old enough to understand. He deserves the chance to know you, Leo, his biological heritage. What are you proposing? Richard asked, hope growing in his chest. A gradual relationship, Sarah replied. Starting as family friends, you visiting occasionally, maybe inviting us to New York from time to time. Over time, when Gabriel is ready, when I am ready, we can tell him the truth in a way that he can understand. That won't traumatize or confuse him. And what about Leo? I want to meet him, Sarah answered without hesitation. I want to see the boy who has been my son in a parallel universe. I want to offer him the same thing I'm asking for Gabriel, a connection, an expansion of family, more people to love and support him. Sarah's words mirrored Richard's exact feelings, the same conclusions he had reached during his solitary reflections. There is one condition, Sarah added, her tone firm again. No courts, no lawyers trying to establish legal rights or formal shared custody. We will trust each other. We will build this relationship based on mutual respect and the well-being of the children. The moment you try to use your power or money to impose your will, that will never happen, Richard promised solemnly. You have my word. That afternoon, Richard was formally introduced to Gabriel as a friend of Mommy's. The boy, naturally extroverted, showed him his favorite toys, told him about his school, and asked 1,000 questions about New York, which he only knew from photographs. When Gabriel ran off to play with a friend who had just arrived at the playground, Richard and Sarah remained seated side by side, contemplating a future neither of them could have imagined a few weeks ago. He has Eleanor's smile, Richard commented softly. And her curiosity, too. Gabriel has always asked 1,000 questions about everything, Sarah agreed, sometimes more than I can answer. And Leo is more observant, quiet, Richard shared. He thinks a lot before he speaks, but when he does, it's usually something surprisingly profound for his age. It was strange and comforting. This exchange of information about their sons, for both children belonged to both of them now, in different but equally valid ways. How is Amelia doing in the meantime? Sarah asked, surprising Richard with the unexpected question. Amelia? Yes, the woman who revealed the truth, who takes care of Leo. You speak of her with a different tone. She seems important to you. Richard reflected on the perceptive observation. It was true. Amelia had become much more than an employee, more even than an ally in the search for truth. She was a constant presence, a pillar of support, a source of wisdom and compassion that had transformed not only Leo's life, but his own. She is special, he finally admitted. Without her, none of this would be possible. The truth would have remained buried. Leo would still be trapped in that chair with no hope of progress, and I would still be hiding behind spreadsheets and meetings to avoid facing real life. She sounds like someone I would like to meet, Sarah commented with a small smile. Someone who risked so much for the truth and for a child's well-being must be an extraordinary person. When Richard finally boarded the plane back to New York the next day, he carried with him not only the promise of a future relationship with Gabriel, but also a new understanding of what family truly meant, not blood ties or legal documents, but daily choices of love, commitment, and courage to face difficult truths. Sarah had agreed to bring Gabriel for a visit to New York during the next school vacation, a cautious first step towards a shared future. Richard, in turn, promised to regularly send news about Leo, photos of his progress, keeping the two families connected even at a distance. Upon landing at JFK Airport, Richard was surprised by an unexpected sight. Amelia and Leo were waiting for him in the arrivals area, the boy in his wheelchair, holding a handmade sign with the words, "Welcome back, Dad," in colorful, uneven letters clearly written by him. You didn't have to come all this way, Richard said, moved by the surprise, bending down to hug his son. It was his idea, Amelia explained, her smile lighting up her face, tired after the car ride to the airport. He couldn't sleep last night from excitement. "I have a surprise, Dad," Leo exclaimed, nearly jumping in his wheelchair. "But I can only show you when we get home." During the entire ride to the mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard told child-friendly versions of his trip, describing the beauties of Charleston, promising to take Leo to see the beaches one day. He spoke of Gabriel and Sarah in simple terms, as new friends who would be visiting soon, carefully planting the seeds for the truth that would one day be revealed. When they finally arrived home, Leo insisted on going straight to the garden, where the parallel bars had been installed for his rehabilitation exercises. Now for the surprise, he announced, vibrant with excitement. With Amelia's help, he positioned the wheelchair between the bars. Then, to Richard's astonishment, the boy gripped the bars firmly with his small but determined hands, and, in a visible effort, lifted himself out of the chair, standing on his own with the orthoses helping to stabilize his legs. "Look, Dad," he exclaimed, his face red from the effort but illuminated with an indescribable pride. "I'm standing." These were not just Leo's first physical steps towards potential independence from the wheelchair. They were symbolic steps for the entire family, towards a future where truths replaced lies, where love transcended biology, where new family configurations were born from the ashes of old betrayals. That night, after putting Leo to bed, exhausted but radiant after repeatedly demonstrating his new achievement, Richard found Amelia on the porch, contemplating the same garden where, weeks ago, they had discussed the discovery that had changed their lives. "Thank you," he said simply, joining her, "for everything." "He's so happy with his progress," she commented, looking towards the parallel bars now silent under the moonlight. "The doctors are optimistic. They say with perseverance, he could achieve much greater mobility than we ever imagined." "It's not just the physical progress," Richard replied. "It's the complete transformation. He smiles, he talks, he makes plans for the future. He has hope. And that, Amelia, we owe mostly to you." She turned to face him, the soft porch light highlighting the sincerity in her brown eyes. "I didn't do it alone. It was your courage to face the truth, to transform yourself as a father, that really changed everything." For a moment, they stood in silence, enjoying the quiet night, the feeling of peace that finally replaced the turmoil of the previous weeks. "And now?" Amelia finally asked. "With Gabriel, Sarah, this whole new family arrangement, now we build bridges," Richard answered, the metaphor coming naturally. "Bridges between the past and the future, between painful truths and possibilities for healing, between families who never imagined they were connected." "It won't be easy," Amelia observed. "The most important things rarely are," he replied, turning to meet her gaze. "But I don't have to do this alone, do I?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implicit meanings, with possibilities that were beginning to take shape on the horizon. Amelia smiled, a smile that held promises of better days, of shared journeys, of discoveries yet to come. "No," she replied simply. "You don't." 6 months later, the garden of the Montgomery mansion witnessed a scene that would have seemed impossible the year before. Leo, supported by specially adapted crutches, taking hesitant but determined steps across the lawn, while Gabriel ran around him, encouraging him with enthusiastic shouts. Sarah and Amelia, sitting side by side on a nearby bench, talked like old friends, sharing stories and experiences of the two children, who now united their lives in unexpected ways. Richard watched the scene from the porch, his heart overflowing with a happiness he had never believed possible. His father's lies, intended to sow division and suffering, had inadvertently created the stage for a redemption greater than anyone could have imagined, not just for him, but for everyone involved in this extraordinary story. In the end, the true miracle was not in the physical steps Leo was beginning to take, nor in the biological connection that had been re-established with Gabriel. The true miracle was in the metaphorical steps they were all taking together, towards truth, towards healing, towards an expanded and enriched definition of what truly constitutes a family. As the sun set on the New York horizon, casting golden shadows over this small nucleus of people, united by extraordinary circumstances, Richard understood the deepest lesson of this entire journey. Families are not defined by blood or legal documents, but by the courage to love despite the circumstances, to choose the truth even when it hurts, to take steps towards one another, one at a time, with patience and hope. And when Amelia joined him on the porch, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that now felt natural and right, Richard knew that the greatest revelation of all had been discovering that the strongest bonds are those we choose to create and nurture every day, with every gesture, with every shared truth, one step at a time. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Richard, Leo, Gabriel, Sarah, and Amelia has touched your hearts. This story shows us that the truth, however painful, has the power to liberate and transform lives when faced with courage. For more emotional stories like this, we have a special playlist prepared just for you. Find it by clicking the button on your left. If this narrative stirred emotions in you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Every day we share new stories that explore the complexities of family ties and the human capacity for resilience. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were in Richard's place? We look forward to reading your thoughts.